phone.
My lady, may I please call Dr. Carol Homden, CBE?
Repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please.
Dr. Homden, thank you very much for coming to help us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Homden, you have provided a witness statement for the inquiry. I think it is in front of you, and our reference for it is INQ 000588056. I think you signed that statement on the 16th of July 2025. Can you confirm, please, that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can so confirm.
Thank you. Dr. Homden, you are giving evidence today in your capacity as the Chief Executive of the Quorum Group of Charities. I understand that you have held that position since 2007, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. And Dr. Homden, the Quorum Group works across a range of activities related to children's lives and prospects. And in your statement, you have described the various ways in which the group does this. Would it be accurate to say, in summary, that Quorum provides adoption, fostering, kinship, therapy, legal and advocacy services for children and families involved with child protection processes, immigration processes and education law, and that it also provides life skills, reading and drama programs in schools, including specialist provisions for children with special educational needs and disabilities, and works with social care professionals through Quorum Bath, and conducts research through the Quorum Institute?
That would be correct.
Thank you. Dr. Homden, to what extent does Quorum operate in these areas across the whole of the UK, in each of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, please?
Thank you. Quorum is distinctive for the fact that it has engagement with all of the local authorities in the whole of the United Kingdom. Through our membership services and the provision of guidance, advice and support to children's services professionals and organisations. But it is also the case that our direct delivery work may be more geographically constrained or limited, dependent upon the particular kind of service that it is. So we reach everywhere in breadth, and we're able to work in depth in particular geographical locations. It would be fair to say that most of that work is within England.
Thank you. And given that breadth of work, there are a number of topics that I would like to ask you about during your evidence. First, some of the challenges that you describe as having been prevalent in children's lives prior to the pandemic. Second, your overview of the impact of the pandemic on children and young people. Third, and in greater detail, your views of its impact on aspects of children's social care in areas of Quorum's work, and specifically we'll focus on fostering and adoption. And fourth, your views of the pandemic's impact on children and young people in contact with the immigration system. Beginning then with some of the challenges that you describe as having been prevalent in children's lives on the eve of the pandemic, if we may. One challenge that you identify was the reduced access to education for children with special educational needs and disabilities. You highlight particular concerns about children losing out on support because of undiagnosed or unmet need, and you suggest that schools were struggling to provide necessary services and that this was a widespread issue. Can you explain this, please? How prevalent was this issue prior to the pandemic, and what sort of impact did Quorum identify that this was having on children and families?
This trend was already well established. So there was a significant increase in diagnosis, particularly of autism. And within the period immediately before the pandemic, the presentation of autism in education, health and care plans became the most prevalent for the first time within a recognised period. It is also the case that this growth in demand was leading to both delay in diagnosis and an under-fulfilment of the education, health and care plans that might lead to. And it was also leading to significant pressures on schools to meet either undiagnosed needs or diagnosed needs in mainstream settings. So schools were already feeling under a great deal of pressure before the pandemic took hold. And local authorities were already struggling with the cost burden and the challenges that they faced in terms of fulfilling the needs of those children. For families, this often meant that families were left alone to struggle with their children's needs, reflected in an already growing number of self-exclusions from school, anxiety disorders which were prevalent in the wider population as well as amongst children with additional needs. So before the pandemic, we already had that circumstance occurring. And we already had a significant challenge in families, in children and families, getting access to justice. So there is a significant shortage of specialist advice for children and families in these circumstances. That has continued and has deepened. Quorum could see evidence of this through our helplines and through our own legal practice. And there was already significant growth in the number of cases being brought to the tribunal where children had waited a very long time, and then actually their case was, in a very substantial percentage of cases, was actually upheld. And for me, that is a particular indicator of a shortfall within our society to meet those children's needs in a timely way, because those rulings are saying that those were cases of merit, and one would expect that our local authority colleagues would have been able to anticipate that. So before the pandemic, that was already a critical issue. We know that for us going forwards, and of course there is a SEND review and an SEND white paper expected in the autumn. And it's one of the biggest conundrums and challenges that our infrastructure now faces going forwards.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. You made the point a moment ago about self-exclusion.
Yes.
And in your statement, you said that prior to the pandemic, children with special educational needs and disabilities were 7 times more likely than their peers to be excluded from school.
Yes.
And you said that more broadly across the general population, rates of suspension and permanent exclusion were high. Based on your work with children and families, what were the principal challenges that they were facing in ensuring that children were able to continue attending and engaging with their education prior to the pandemic?
That is a complex picture, of course, because when we describe special educational needs and disabilities, we're rarely very specific about what we mean in terms of the precise circumstances of a child. So I will focus on those additional needs for attending school and for participating in school, as opposed to medical needs, about which I'm much less well informed. So some of the challenges that were being faced are high anxiety. So particularly in the case of autistic children, and I have an autistic son myself, we have a combination of issues that are being faced, where children feel that they are not welcome in school, or they're not supported sufficiently in school, which leads to a cycle of behaviours for them to gain the attention and additional support that they need, and then to the risks of exclusion that those behaviours lead to. So sometimes, however, the exclusion process itself feels, both to families and to the staff in schools, like that is the only trigger that is actually going to lead to the assessment that the child needs or to the additional support that is required for the education, health and care plan. So children who are feeling anxious are going to struggle to make it into school. And if you are a parent and your child is saying to you, I would rather die than go to school, these are the kinds of circumstances that families would be facing. I remember being asked by an Ofsted inspector about progress and in a school context, and pointing out that one of the first challenges was for the child in a special school to actually have the confidence, security and support to get into the taxi and to then get from the taxi through the school doors before we could actually embark upon building their educational learning and skills. But most of these issues that I'm pointing to are the issues that lie in mainstream. It is relatively unusual for children to be excluded from school without a managed move process in the special schools, as they are known. But the issues fall for children who are struggling to cope with the burdens the additional burdens they face in mainstream. And it is worth us just thinking what those burdens are. They exacerbate in secondary with the pressures upon children to move about from different classes, to engage in social exchange in corridors, often in very, very large and very noisy settings. So these issues will affect those who are not just autistic, but who are struggling to cope with social pressure. The other thing we need to just reflect upon is the sheer scale of issues that are being faced by children in school. It is something up to a third of children who say that they're afraid to go to school because of bullying. And one of the things that's really key that I want to draw attention to in our consideration of the impact of the pandemic is when it has occurred, which is that it has occurred at a moment not only when social policy has led to a period of reductions in public spending, which fell particularly on youth services, but it came at a point when we were already experiencing the start of the impact of the shift to a digital-first generation, which is unique in history. So children having access and living their lives through digital media with the high levels of contact time on screen and also the social media invasion into their lives, which continues beyond the school borders in a way that it never used to, into their home and is affecting their self-regulation and their developmental journey. So it is really important that we note that this is when the occurrence took place unique in history for the closure of schools.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. You make that link in your statement between the digital-first generation and rates of mental health risks among children and young people prior to the pandemic. What was it in Quorum's work that you were noticing that leads you to make that link?
Well, it's a really interesting question. We were observing it across all of our services, both directly and indirectly. So the nature of perhaps calls to our helplines, where there would be a factor of mental health issues. And remember, the mental health issues that we're seeing are not only those of the child themselves, they may actually be within the family of a parent placing particular challenges. So we're seeing it in our helplines. We do provide therapeutic services directly, small scale, but with a specialism in working with children who are adopted or on special guardianship orders. And we were seeing it coming out from various evidential reports, of course, that we were aware of, and through our work with local authority teams who were talking about these issues well before the pandemic took hold.
Thank you. And on the subject of local authorities, another trend that you identify in your statement is that in 2018 to 2019, so the year before the pandemic, there were record numbers of children in care in England and Wales. And you say there were 90 children entering the care system each day, with 61% of them doing so because of abuse or neglect.
Yes.
What did Quorum observe to be the effect of this on the ability of the providers of children's social care to meet those children's needs?
Well, the providers of children's social care, and these are our local authority colleagues, and I commend them for their work as the frontline, almost A&E service for our children, were experiencing profound pressures. They were facing the tension between increasing demand and constrained resources, and also workforce challenges, depending on where children were in the country, of course, their experiences would be different. So one of the things that, again, we need to note was already the case before the pandemic took hold, was that children's chances in life already depended on where they lived and who they lived with. And there's a significant variation, which indeed the Department for Education flagged up as one of the key circumstances that it needed to address as the pandemic took hold. The great variation between performance, access, and quality and sufficiency between one local authority area and another. So that was a double whammy, a conundrum of growing demand and reduced access to resources that makes it difficult for them to respond in a timely way. Therefore, we would also see, and on our helplines we could see, delay is bad for children, and delay is experienced in increasing levels throughout this period, throughout all of the services that children may need to access.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. I'd like to turn then to the pandemic itself. And I think it is your analysis that the impact of school closures and lockdowns was to compound challenges for children across the country, and particularly for those living in difficult family circumstances. And we know from your statement that Quorum had conducted a vulnerability report for the Children's Commission in 2019, and that you found that 2.3 million children were identified as potentially living with risk because of their family backgrounds. You say of this in your statement that the well-being of these children is not a marginal issue. What did you mean by that?
What I mean is that as a society, if we have as many as 2.3 million children living with identified risks, then we cannot see this as anything other than a key priority for us as a society, because this is too substantial a number, but also is a key moral duty of society to prepare for the next generation of citizens. And of course, unless we do so, we will reap the consequences. So sometimes there can be a tendency to become familiar with trends and facts as if they are inevitable. It is not inevitable that this number of children should live in these circumstances in our society. There are actions that we can take in resourcing and in prioritisation in order to make that change. And that is our social policy imperative.
Thank you. One of the things that you say in your statement about the decision to close schools and to impose the first lockdown is that neither the UK government nor any other government of the devolved nations consulted with Quorum in respect of the potential impact of children on those decisions. It may be said, Dr. Homden, that the decision to close schools and to lock down was necessarily taken as an emergency decision, with very little, if any, time to consult with organisations outside of government. First, what would you say to that? And second, what do you say are the consequences of that lack of consultation?
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that it is very important that we all accept the fact that this was an unprecedented circumstance, a national emergency and a global emergency. And therefore, the best possible informed decisions needed to be made, and needed to be made in a timely way by government. And I commend them for their service in making those difficult decisions. I make it as a factual statement that Quorum was not consulted. I would not have thought that it was particularly imperative for them to consult Quorum per se, although I do think that there are particular ways in which both Quorum and other parts of the third sector could have assisted government in its forward planning. But in relation to the closure of schools, what I think is more pertinent is, and I'm sure that they will have consulted with some of the larger teaching representative organisations, for example, is to consult the Office of the Children's Commissioner whose role is to stand by, for and with our children in order just to anticipate what the issues and consequences of that closure may be. The department did identify vulnerable children and the risk of harm to those children as a key priority in their planning, which they rightly should. But the criteria that they were using, it would appear from evidence given, was prioritising other factors to do with workforce sufficiency and potentially the risk of many more children having to come into care, rather than the needs and best interests of children in their lives and in their everyday lives. One of the key things that I would want to draw attention to for the whole of this inquiry is that children's timescales are different. So for us, different stages of our adult life, 6 months may not seem a very long time. If you are 6 months old, it is your entire life. If decisions of the court are delayed and extended, you are losing moments for your neurological and physiological development, which you don't get back. And unless you progress, and you will have specialist evidence from child development experts, which I am not, but I think we all know as parents that children need to move through their developmental stages. And if one of those is placed on pause, they still have that journey to take. And I say that because we are coming to your second point, which is, so what were the consequences? The consequences, therefore, were mostly predictable. And as I say, the department did predict the increased risk to children living in the most vulnerable circumstances. Whether our response to that was sufficient is a different question, but they did identify that consequence. But the overarching issue for children was that they depend uniquely on access to school, not just for the fulfillment of their right to education, but for their social development, for their social and relational functioning, for learning skills that were already being placed at greater need because of living in the digital first generation. And what we have done is applied a very significant pause button to that, which affected children at different ages and stages to different extent, but affected them all. Children often require and depend upon school for respite from complex and difficult circumstances at home. They depend on it for food if they are living in families which have very, very limited means. They depend upon it for the ability for them to take their first steps towards independence, to learn self-regulation and self-management. And therefore, all of those things were placed on hold. Families with the greatest means would be able perhaps to compensate to the greatest levels, although I make no judgment upon any parent in any circumstance, and I commend them all for all of their work to love, nurture, and support their children. So these were the biggest consequences. There has never been a moment that I am aware of where we have closed schools. And what we did with that was that we changed the social contract with our children at the very moment when the children perhaps needed the greatest consistency and regularity of access to school because of the changes that this generation was experiencing.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. I think if I've understood correctly, that you have said that it was all the more important for this generation to be attending school because they are the digital first generation. How so?
Well, firstly, because we've learned a lot more since the pandemic, because these trends, of course, have accelerated, and the pandemic was like a fast forward button that we pressed that led probably to trends that may well have developed in any case. If you are spending a great deal of time on your screen, Do you learn all of the ways of picking up upon physical cues? Do you learn how to navigate conflict in groups? Do you learn how to form effective and lasting friendships? Or does friendship get defined as the number of people that are following your social media channel? So the how-so there is about the fact that there is a renegotiation going on, really, of the importance and a need for school, not only for learning skills, to develop the skills of learning, but also to develop the skills of social and relational functioning. You will learn other skills online, and we all need to recognise that our children live in a world that is unknown to us, perhaps more than at any point in history. But the challenges that children were facing are following them into the home, and we crystallised that moment and made sure that was what was happening in terms of their social dynamics, with all the risks that brings, following them into the bedroom at night. Sleep dysregulation, lack of sleep, and compounded that with a lack of physical activity and what one would describe as the age-old benefits of play and outdoor life. So it was compounded by those particular circumstances.
Thank you. You point out in your statement that lost learning during the pandemic, resulting from school closure and education disruption, affected pupils who are already comparatively disadvantaged more than it affected others.
Yeah.
And you say that it was equivalent to undoing a third of the progress made in the previous decade.
Yes.
On closing the gap between disadvantaged pupils and their peers in primary school. Can you explain to us, please, why you say it is particularly important to look at that attainment gap as opposed to looking at attainment on the whole?
Yes. There is an old saying, which is that we are only as strong as our weakest link. And for all our children have the same rights and entitlements, and we cannot leave some of them behind because we have done better at the top end. That is not what a society that is committed to the health and well-being of all our children can accept. We already know that there is a very significant correlation between engagement and outcomes at school of parents with the engagement and outcomes at school of children. We already know that living in poverty compounds the stress and difficulties of families and the engagement of children with school. We already know that unmet needs will lead to lower outcomes. We already know that for children facing young carer duties, for example, that attendance at school means that the lack of attendance at school can compromise their outcomes. So I'd just ask you to repeat the question to make sure that I answer exactly what it is that you are asking. Because
Certainly.
as far as I can see, we have a social and moral duty to ensure that all our children have the best possible chance in life.
Thank you, Dr. Hamden. If it helps, I think you have answered the question.
Okay, thank you.
With regard to our youngest children,
Yes.
we know that nurseries and other early years settings were closed across the UK from
Yes.
the 23rd of March through to around mid to late June, except for vulnerable children and those of key workers, and that whilst they were permitted to remain open at other times in the pandemic, attendance rates continued to be low.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can look, please, at paragraph 160 of your statement, which is at pages 39 to 40. Thank you. Dr. Hamden, I hope it's on the screen in front of you.
Oh, it is on screen. You're quite right.
Thank you. We see there at paragraph 160 reference to research undertaken by PACEY, and I
Yeah.
think that is the Professional Association of Childcare and Early Years, who are part of the Quorum Group. And that research identified a decline in the mental health and well-being of children in the setting, and I understand that to be as compared to children prior to the pandemic.
Yes.
And we see highlighted, please, at paragraphs 160.1 through to 160.5, the rates at which problems for those children, as identified by their care workers, had been observed. Looking at this list, Dr. Homden, what do you think it tells us about the effect of lockdown and the closure of settings on the youngest children?
Yes, it's a very important question because infants do tend to get overlooked, and yet the issues for them will and may last a lifetime. So what we can observe from this is that there were benefits for children spending more time with their parents. We know that. We know that infants may well benefit from time with their principal caregivers. But what we are seeing here is children then becoming increasingly struggling to access the support of other adults. And we know that there are key moments when children, for example, start school, when children need to have learned these skills around how to cope with separation, how to engage in a group. And what we have here is evidence from the largest body of childminders across the country, which therefore have a vast level of experience in practice of supporting young children in home-based care. And they are identifying for us that we have stored up some further developmental needs in the children that are the youngest in our population by them not being able to attend their childminder or their nursery. I was surprised to read that the decline in physical health was lower, because I think one of the key things that comes across from others in the evidence is the importance of physical play and physical development. But of course, for the youngest children, they are able perhaps to develop those with the support of their caregivers even in constrained spaces. But for older children, that becomes increasingly important.
Thank you. That can come down now. Dr. Homden, elsewhere in your statement, we don't need to go there, but it's at paragraph 158, you describe some of the factors that you say affected children and young people's mental health. You say one cause of the increase in distress and anxiety among children during the pandemic was the sudden exposure to an environment characterized by illness and bereavement and emotional, psychological, or financial strains. Yeah. The impact on children of these challenges is starker and more harmful to their well-being than for adults. In particular, such exposures potentially have long-term impacts on neurological development in infants, and I think you've just been referring to that. Yes. Can you just explain, please, a little more why you say those exposures are different for children and perhaps particularly young children?
Yes. We know that children are affected by adult stress and by adult mental health issues. They're remarkably attuned to environmental factors of that kind. But what happened in the lockdown was that they were right up front, right up close with those issues, and in circumstances where their family might well have been experiencing much more family tensions, much higher levels of anxiety, perhaps about the health of other relatives that they couldn't see, and also financially they may have been under considerable strain through, for example, whether individuals had been furloughed or not furloughed, and so on. So children were right up close with the adult concerns in a way that most parents try to protect their children from. And that has an effect on them. They take on those burdens. We see in some of the evidence provided not only the burden on young carers, which became extreme during this period, but also on other children trying to help, being worried about their grandparents. Most children will live their lives relatively insulated from these stresses as a general factor. And when the news is on every day talking about the number of people who are dying, that is, again, a unique moment, because we don't every year publicize how many people are dying, for example, from the latest flu occurrence. But in this case, it was saturation experience. And for children who haven't developed, depending on their age and stage, who haven't yet been exposed to those issues or had fragilities and worries of their own already, then that places a significant burden on them, and a large number of children have been left with the consequences of that in terms of a heightened likelihood of anxiety and a struggle to be resilient, particularly in relation to issues that they feel are outside of their control. And we're seeing that constantly with children talking about whether their voices are heard and what the adult world is deciding, which they may feel that they do not have agency over. Children who have agency in their lives, who feel consulted, who feel that they can express their wishes and feelings, are healthier than those who cannot.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. I'd like to move now to our third topic and to ask you about some specific measures that were taken during the pandemic, which impacted groups of children whom Quorum particularly work with. First of all, some aspects of children's social services.
Yes.
Would you agree, Dr. Homden, that one of the most fundamental changes to the way that children and young people experience social care during the pandemic was that it became harder for children and families to interact with social workers face-to-face? You're nodding.
Yes, this was, of course, inevitable in circumstances of social distance management. It was, however, uneven, and the lack of clarity in terms of guidance and the variation of interpretation certainly means that children in different places or different points on the children's social care spectrum may have struggled more or less. I suspect that that was inevitable, although I would call for, in future, more decisive clarity and guidance to our social workers. One of the things that Quorum sought to do, because of our extensive work at the heart of that community of practice, was to provide guidance. For example, we continue to run activity days for adoption, and managed to do so applying social distance measures to ensure that children didn't lose their chance of adoption. They age out. They couldn't wait a lot longer. But we would find that there was challenges for social workers from different local authorities in knowing whether they could engage in those events and what the rules were locally, in addition to, of course, perhaps considerations of their own personal circumstances, anxieties, and health needs. So I do feel that one of the learnings here is that organisations like Quorum could assist the department for us to at least narrow the variation in our approaches so that children could depend, and families could depend upon a more consistent set of responses. It's understood that this was a very dynamic circumstance, but we can move in consort with each other, bearing in mind that the challenges that were faced were common to every local authority, even if their circumstances were different. So, yes, it meant that there was less face-to-face engagement and contact, particularly at particular periods. The children that are closest to my worry in that circumstance were those the department had already identified, those who were already known to social services for potential risk of harm, and the ones who were not yet known, who might not get to be known in their timescale, because schools are not just the place of learning, social development and food. They are also the eyes and advocates for a child who will make very many referrals. And the same is true also of charitable organisations providing other forms of support to vulnerable families, and that was disrupted as well. However, the evidence is mixed because for some young people, children and young people, but particularly those who have special educational needs and education, health and care plans. In my experience, the connectivity with school was often stronger because there was more remote access and more emphasis on communication and constant dual planning. And for those who were in care and leaving care, the remote access to social workers and to their personal advisors may in fact have been better and more reliable than it was before, and also perhaps more attuned to the preferences and communication styles of older young people.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. I'd like to pick up on some of those issues now in a bit more detail, please. You have referred to the services that Quorum provides in the field of adoption. And if we can look, please, at paragraph 107 of your witness statement, that's at page 29.
Yes.
These are, as you have referred to, passages about Quorum's adoption activity days. And we can see, if we can look, please, at paragraphs 107 through to 111, that you referred a moment ago to being able to maintain some of that service.
Yes.
I think you tell us in your witness statement that at times it was necessary to cancel those.
Yes.
First of all, I think it would be right, would it, to say that those days are quite personal occasions. They're about bringing families and children and social workers together to meet in a room. And you tell us that between March and June 2020, you had to cancel these events due to restrictions. That staff were furloughed while others worked on developing an online linking service. That between July and September 2020, the rules allowed family finding to occur as an essential service subject to social distancing. And at paragraph 110, you tell us that a further lockdown period prevented events from November 2020 to March 2021 continuing. And you tell us at paragraph 111 that because these events did not take place at the same frequency or scale during the specified period, there are children who aged out of adoption and therefore lost their chance of a permanent loving home. Can you just expand on that for us, please? What does it mean to age out of adoption, and what is the impact on that of a child?
Yes. The vast majority of children who are adopted in this country are adopted under the age of 5. And it becomes increasingly challenging to find the potential adoptive home for children as they enter their school-age years. That is partly, it's a long-standing issue and trend, partly because, of course, potential adopters want to be in the lives of their child, what will become their child, for as long as possible. And we also want children who have often been taken into care in infancy and received an adoption placement order in infancy, not to be waiting for a long period before they get that permanent stability. And of course, we have to remember in these circumstances that the alternative to achieving that placement will be long-term foster care and potentially many moves, which is not good for children's neurological attachment and development. So what this literally means is that if there's a 6-month delay, then a child will have less chance. It's not more complicated than that. The adoption activity days I would describe as a child's best last chance, because those tend to be focused on the children who have been waiting the longest, where our agency colleagues in local authorities have not yet managed to find an adopter, and they are wishing to work with us to see whether across different geographical boundaries they are able to find adopters before the child runs out of age chances and that they have to make other plans. Now, there are some very important factors that we need to identify within this. The first to say is that that the waiting times for children were already extending before the pandemic. Court delays were already systematic. I mean, the time scale of the court does not match the time scale of the child, even in the best of times. But if there are court delays, then the child may not even have the decision that they need. And so they may age out even before the process of matching begins.
And if I may, Dr. Homden, ask you in connection with that to look, please, at INQ 000541118. Is
that going to come up?
It is going to come up, yes.
The department's evidence.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
This is the Department for Education's report for the year 2021.
Indeed.
Called Children Looked After in England, including adoptions. And this is, I think, page 15 of it. And we see that it says the number of CLA, and that means children looked after, doesn't it? So children who are in local authority care, who were adopted, fell by 18% in 2021. The large decrease in CLA adopted this year is likely a result of the impact on court proceedings during the pandemic, where cases progressed more slowly or were paused. Do you agree then, Dr. Homden, with what is said here, that the primary reason for that reduction is in court delays?
It was an additional reason.
What other factors should we take into
I think
account?
that, as I have said, any delay in court process compromises the speed of decision that is needed for a child, and that will have significant consequences for them. And it is certainly the case that the pandemic period led to a significant lengthening of that time. However, I would draw attention to the fact that the number of adoptions was already falling. And that is worthy of a moment of exploration, which is that I'm always interested to read what the comparator trend is setting in terms of the timescale. But I draw your attention to the fact that the baseline average of adoptions over many, many years was around 3,500. Adoption is a service for children, and it is for the few rather than the many. That has always been true. But in the adoption reform programme that followed 2011, there was a huge effort to ensure that children who had been waiting for quite a long time in the adoption service, in the adoption system, were matched. And that led to a very significant apparent increase in adoptions, which was an increase in our success in achieving adoptions that were already there, rather than an increase in orders. And then we talk about the fall since that exceptional peak. So it's really important to look at these trends. The number of adoptions was down, and it was down correlating with a period of structural reform of the organisation of adoption into regional agencies. That kind of structural reform might also lead to additional delays. In addition to which, there is the supply of potential adopters to consider. And the sadness here in this figure is that the initial inquiries from people interested and prepared to adopt went up. So it was almost as if the focus on the importance of family life and the time that people had to reflect was leading to them thinking that they would consider adoption. And it's particularly sad, therefore, that the combination of issues of lack of access to matching services, to delays in the court, and to structural reforms did not lead to more children getting their chance. I also draw attention to the fact that there was previously an adoption register for England that had matched a significant number of children, around 150 plus each year, which had been suspended in the period before the pandemic. And had that still been in place, there would have been the opportunity for a great deal more remote matching and proactive matching for children.
Thank you. If we can look, please, at INQ 000541149, and specifically at page 22 of that, please. These are the updated figures. This is the most recent report. And we see in that larger paragraph towards the top, and particularly starting from the middle, there was a further fall in 2021 during the pandemic, which was a result of the impact on court proceedings during the pandemic, where cases progressed more slowly or were paused. However, since then, the number of adoptions has remained at or just under 3,000 a year. So we see that, in fact, these numbers haven't recovered.
No.
Should we understand, Dr. Homden, that to be an enduring impact of the pandemic, or is it, as you have said, a complex combination of other factors?
Yes, it is a longer-term trend that we are experiencing, but most certainly it is true that it has not recovered to the historic baseline level, which would have been more like 3,500 or so since the pandemic. And we are now facing a particular further challenge in that we have a very significant insufficiency of adopters. So the inquiries went up with the start of the pandemic, but the number of approvals of adopters has fallen. You can't adopt children unless you have adopters. So, in fact, the key consideration, there have been efforts in recruitment campaigns and so on, but as a society, we need to consider what we're doing to ensure that everyone who can potentially care for our most vulnerable children are enabled to do so by timely decision-making, by reliability of access to support and ongoing support if that is needed. And we need to consider the continuum of care that children need. We should not pit one form of order against another. So adoption, fostering, respite care, residential care, kinship care are all part of the same spectrum of care that we need as a society to ensure that we can give the children that we owe the duty to the reliable, timely and sufficient loving home that they deserve. We have a lot of work to do. It is on the social policy agenda.
Doctor, and I know this is terribly important and obviously a great passion of yours. I do understand, but I've got to bring you back to the pandemic. I can't change the overall system, much as I might like to. I did a fair bit of children work in my time, and so I know how important it is, but I've got to bring you back to the pandemic.
Yes, apologies. There are children we could have matched in the pandemic that we didn't match because we didn't use all the available tools.
Thank you. And the statistics that we have been looking at are from England.
Yeah.
But are you aware, through Quorum's work throughout the pandemic, throughout the UK, of whether there are similar trends in the devolved nations, or are you unable to say?
I don't have the figures at my disposal. What I would say to you is that in the United Kingdom, the majority of adoption is in England because of the distribution of children, and also that the three nations retained their adoption registers.
Thank you. I'd like to turn then to some of the changes made during the pandemic that affected children who were fostered. And we know that some changes made through the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2020 meant that some children in private foster care arrangements would wait longer for their social worker to visit their placement, and that some children in temporary or emergency foster care may be in that arrangement for longer than usual before they were visited by a social worker. From the point of view of Quorum's experience in working in this field, what were your concerns about the impact of these changes on children in foster care placements?
Well, our concerns are always whether children's experiences and needs are being met and prioritised, and how you know whether they are. And so delays in access to social workers or assessments weakens the way in which we can ensure that children have the support that they need. Having said that, the changes were almost certainly necessary in order to overall manage the challenges of the pandemic and of workforce availability. And these were part of the difficult decisions that government needed to make, was to look at private fostering arrangements do tend to lack the focus and attention that they might justify generally. But I think that it was almost certainly inevitable that there were such delays, and as I've said before, delays weaken our accountability to children.
Would you have any particular concerns about children in temporary or emergency foster care placements, perhaps being in those placements for longer than usual before they were visited?
Yes, of course, because we need to ensure that temporary and emergency arrangements are sufficient. However, I would point out that our social workers are making a decision that emergency and temporary arrangements are in the child's best interest. And I think my bigger concern throughout the whole of the considerations of the pandemic is what was happening for children who were not in the care system. In fact, it's the children in need, the children that were previously subject to concern but not to new arrangements, who will have missed out to the greatest extent. And as the department had flagged up in its planning, that they might be subject to further harm by remaining in circumstances which were then under greater stress. So my concern is more for them, whilst of course understanding that for any individual child there may have been consequences for an extended stay in an arrangement that would not normally have been considered for the longer term.
Thank you. I think you made the point earlier about there being or about you querying whether there was an adequate amount of guidance associated with social work practice, perhaps under the regulations.
Yes.
Were you satisfied that social workers had enough guidance or had the guidance that they needed to make those decisions that you have just described about whether or not they needed to visit, for example, an emergency foster placement?
I think there's always room for more clarity and more guidance. Of course, social workers are operating within a supervised arrangement environment with their local authority leaders who are there to support them. Many of them were telephoning and utilising the CORE and BAF arrangements and helplines that could help problem solve, because some of this would be around timeliness and problem solving in a very dynamic situation. But as I've said before, I think that there was a lost opportunity to work with organisations like CORE and BAF to support the ADCS and local government colleagues, and indeed the charitable sector, which often working closely with them, to have more consistent guidance. That if one waits for a situation in which you know all that you might possibly wish to know, you will usually have delayed the decision longer than was helpful. And in this circumstance, it wasn't possible to know. So clear guidance that says, at present, do this, and consistently addressing some of the circumstances. We, for example, gave guidance on introductions, on whether children who needed to move should be moved, and what the considerations should be on that. Because most things that needed to be done potentially could be done. It would be the question of what arrangements and what resourcing would be required, and whether there was access to the testing equipment, for example, and that would allow for self-isolation and so on to take place. So always room for more guidance, and more organisations potentially could help to support the consistency of support to social workers facing these very difficult decisions.
Thank you. So in that connection, can I ask you please to look at paragraph 222 of your statement, which is at the bottom of page 53.
Yes.
And this is where you make the point, I think, that you've just been describing, that the Department for Education could have mobilised pre-existing structures,
yes,
such as CORE and BAF, or the Adoption and Special Guardianship Leadership Board. You say, ultimately, in the absence of clear leadership, a group of experts in the field, namely representatives of CORE and BAF and the Royal College of Paediatrics, the NHS lead for children in care, and the National Network of Designated Healthcare Professionals for Children consulted with each other and developed guidance on issues such as the conduct of medical and health assessments for children going through the process of being placed. So do I understand it to be your suggestion that in future there ought to be formal mechanisms for organisations such as Quorum to provide that sort of guidance where the Department for Education hasn't yet been able to?
That would be my recommendation. In a circumstance of national emergency, we all need to marshal and mobilise the infrastructure and expertise that we have in service of our children. The Department for Education should not have to stand alone in that task. So therefore, it is my view that we could be foresighted in establishing those mechanisms, and perhaps proactively bodies such as these that I've cited could come together with at least a mandate from the department to anticipate what types of circumstances we might face in a future emergency, and stand ready to assist by mobilising the infrastructure, trust and confidence that we have amongst the professionals of different disciplines.
Thank you. And just before we move on from that, I think I understand from paragraph 223 that a further example of that was the use, for example, of virtual adoption panels. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. We also know that the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment regulations had the potential to impact young people who were leaving care or who had recently left care. And Quorum Voice, I understand, undertook research with care leavers in England to ascertain their experiences of the pandemic. And I think you've already referred to that in your evidence. You said that, to paraphrase, some of the findings were actually that communication had improved. If you want to look at them, Dr. Homden, they are at paragraphs 212 to 213 of your statement. So would it be right then that, thank you, if we could please highlight the findings under paragraph 213, that whilst these are framed in negative terms, so for example, not all care leavers had consistent leaving care workers, your view is that actually there were positive and negative impacts on care leavers from the pandemic?
Yes, indeed. I think what this is showing is that our baseline for comparison isn't good enough. That actually, as a society, we want to lift that up in terms of the experience and expectation of our care leavers generally. But in the pandemic, the situation did not worsen. Local authorities prioritised, and this is broadly, an individual child may have experienced more difficulty, but broadly it was prioritised. Local authorities and government did understand the issues that are faced in terms of loneliness, in terms of the need for emotional support and financial pressures, and actions were taken. So it does show that prioritisation made a difference and did actually potentially mitigate what could have been a deepening of these negative trends, and it did not.
Thank you very much, Dr. Homden. I'd like now to come to, I think, our fourth topic, another aspect of Quorum's specialist work, and that is the experience of children and young people who are in contact with the immigration system.
Yes.
First of all, Dr. Homden, as a principle, why are there fundamental differences between the needs of children in contact with the immigration system and those of adults in contact with the immigration system? Why is there a need to consider them differently?
Well, I think the first thing we need to note is that children are children first before they may experience any other circumstances, and therefore that we have a duty to consider their best interests given their age and vulnerability. So that's the main reason why we need to consider the adult population and child population differently, is that we as a society define our duties to children distinctly, and those duties apply to this population of children just as they apply to any other child within the nation. So we need to consider, therefore, in the context of the pandemic, some of the experiences for children who were involved in the immigration system were the same as the other circumstances that we've described. Children were already waiting in families or alone with a very long period of time indeed before being able to feel a sense of security, to know what their situation was and to be able to get their life back on track. And that was worsened considerably. We also have children uniquely without recourse to public funds, a unique category of children. And we also have the experience of children uniquely in the pandemic being housed in hotels, which, when we consider the clear criteria for safety and well-being of children, could not be met by such a circumstance.
Thank you. We will come to that specific issue in a moment. I think you have had the opportunity to consider a witness statement from Sir Matthew Rycroft on behalf of the Home Office. And we know from that witness statement that from the 27th of February 2020, the advice from Public Health England to local authorities was that they should assume that all children with uncertain travel histories had travelled through countries that were potentially sources of infection and should therefore be required to self-isolate.
Yeah.
We will be hearing from Sir Matthew later in these hearings, and I want to ask you really about the implications of that for the children and young people concerned. If we can look, please, at INQ 000518555. This is an email that was passing between officials at the Home Office and the Department for Education on the 9th of March 2020, so at a time when that guidance that I've just described was in force. We read about details of instances where LA, so that's local authorities, have pushed back following a request to provide support for UASC, and that's unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, isn't it, from our operational teams in IE, I think that is Immigration Enforcement, and UK VI. And what we see is that unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in Humberside were identified, 4 minors, on the 7th of March 2020. That Humberside Police are currently running an operation whereby any illegal entrants have a medical assessment, and following examination at A&E, they were advised to self-isolate for 14 days. None of the individuals presented any COVID-19 symptoms, and it is believed that advice was given due to the travel route to the UK. Children's services were contacted, who said that they would not age assess or house the minors. NCCU, working with the police, were required to push back hard on children's services, involving several conversations before children's services eventually agreed to house the minors and conduct age assessments. First of all, before I ask about the experiences of those individuals, we see what appears to be an element of confusion between different branches of government about whose responsibility it would have been to look after these individuals. From your work in this space, does that surprise you?
Sadly, it does not surprise me. It is a constant occurrence that there will be pushback by local authorities in housing unaccompanied children who are seeking asylum because of the pressures and burdens upon them. That's particularly true. I commend our colleagues in Kent and other areas who have so nobly stepped forward to support children. But that does not surprise me in the least bit. It is not acceptable, and it must not recur. In fact, the responsibilities are clear, and the department wrote, as we saw in other evidence, to clarify the responsibility. That does not, however, remove the complexity or challenges in the face of a very significant increase in the number of children needing such accommodation. And if there is to be a duty, then we actually do need to plan for and resource the fulfilment of that duty. And the absence, it was predictable that there would continue to be this need. Obviously, exactly where it might occur might be much more difficult to identify, although I'm not an expert in that, in the travel circumstances, but nonetheless, a great deal is known about those pathways. So we do have to step up our planning and provision. What I would also say is just imagine being one of those young people, not speaking the language, arriving in such circumstances, and then having to be alone in a room with no one to support you for 14 days.
Yes, I think it is that aspect of it that I particularly want to ask you about. You have spoken about complexity in the system in terms of whose responsibility it is. Would you agree that it is all the more complicated if actually what's required is the provision of presumably accommodation and support for 14 days of self-isolation?
Yes, I would. And clearly these were unprecedented circumstances for us all. I mean, the whole country was struggling with the issues, needs and compliances with 14 days self-isolation, even when we were, within our own home or, in circumstances where we were not alone and afraid. We had others that we could connect to. But I come back to the fact that the needs of the young people are entirely understood and predictable. The question is, do we plan, resource and equip to meet those needs? So having sufficient and appropriate accommodation and having a workforce that is equipped and trained to support those young people is a genuine need. And in this circumstance, it required intensive joined up working to problem solve in the particular circumstance that has occurred. But of course we don't know is whether these young people actually went on to develop COVID, and I suspect that they didn't, in which case there is a different lesson there about which did change in the course of the pandemic in terms of testing and identifying when symptomatic, because that would have made an enormous difference in this particular circumstance.
And Dr. Homden, do you draw any lesson about policies of self-isolation for young children or even older children, particularly in circumstances where they are unaccompanied?
Yeah, no child should be unseen or alone. The idea that a child could spend 14 days alone, even if they are in the older age of childhood, that is a burden we would all seek to prevent and avoid. And it is most likely, in my mind, that preventing and avoiding it could have been perhaps problem solved if we had thought about this issue more clearly. What have we done since to identify that it's not only the pandemic, it's not only that particular infection, there are protocols for other forms of self-isolation to be required? Are the lessons that we could learn from that? But in everything we do, we need to put the child first and remember that children are children first. And if they suffer the additional difficulties of lack of language, lack of understanding of the system, or delays in decision-making, then the consequences to them are more extreme than they might be to other members of the population.
Thank you, Dr. Homden. I'd just like to ask you to look at one more document before we take our break, please. It is INQ 000587936. This is the Children and Young People Voices report undertaken for this inquiry. And if we can look, please, at page 205, and this is in the section of the report that is about the experiences of young people who arrived in the UK
Yes.
during lockdown and many of them highlighted feelings of isolation and fear, as well as specific challenges. Can I ask you please to look at the first complete quote at the top of that page? When I came, it was like in the beginning or the middle of COVID-19. I had to stay, I think it was 15 days alone without contact. Because I came to the UK without no one, like I was alone, I was sad because I was missing people. You feel lonely, sometimes depressed, and yeah, I was scared. And it continues. From the work that Quorum undertakes with young people in this position, is that an account that you recognise?
I absolutely recognise it, and as ever, the voice of the young people speaks truth to power. That is the experience of all too many young people every day, not the 15 days of isolation for medical emergency, but the feelings of sadness, of loneliness, of confusion and of anxiety, a lack of understanding of what the process is going to follow, not knowing who to trust. These are the experiences of young people every day in these circumstances. So there was a significant difference, and it comes across in the testimony of this excellent report that has been produced for the inquiry. That clearly, if you were already in the UK, you had arrived, and you were in a different circumstance. You potentially had access to slightly more networks of support than if you were a new arrival. That is predictable. We can see that if there's another national emergency, that needs to be planned for, and the needs of the young people put first, particularly in relation to their safety in the accommodation that they are placed in. We cannot have children mixed in with adults and left in environments with potentially under-resourced or under-skilled adults to support and protect them. And I can see no reason why the teaching of English could not have been taking place by some means, even during that period.
Thank you very much, Dr. Homden. We will come to some of those issues after the break.
Thank you. We'll take a break now. I shall return at past.
All rise.
Let's go in.
Thank you, my lady. Dr. Homden, before the break, you had just referred to children in contact with the immigration system living in hotels and unregulated placements. And we know, Dr. Homden, that in 2020, a situation arose in which a significant number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children were housed in hotels, particularly after having entered the UK in Kent. And we will hear more about the reasons that happened in due course, particularly from our witnesses who are attending from the Home Office and Kent County Council. I want to understand what you think the effect of those circumstances would have been on those children and young people, to help us understand that evidence when we get there. One of the things that you say in your witness statement about this is that children who are housed by the Home Office in hotels were not accessing local authority care that they would have been entitled to had they been accommodated by the local authority. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And I'd like to understand, please, what you say that would mean for those children. What would it be that they were entitled to, for example, in respect of education, that they would get if they were accommodated by the local authority, which they're not entitled to if they're being accommodated by the Home Office, please?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that our duty to safeguarding is paramount, and whatever the emergency, that remains, and that hotel accommodation will always struggle to not only to provide for that duty, but also for the developmental needs of children and young people, as you have sufficient evidence to testify. In the event that a child is accommodated by the local authority, they get the full force of the local authority's capacity and capability. So they have the entitlement to social work support and to all of the provisions that have been made within our statutory framework. When there are not those eyes, when there is not that person standing by the side of the child, then the child is much less likely to access them.
Thank you. And can I ask you specifically, during a pandemic,
yes,
what would it be that they wouldn't be getting that they would be entitled to if they were in local authority care that matters particularly in the circumstances of a pandemic?
As I understand it, and I'm not a technical specialist on the legal parameters for that, it is basically the social work and the social work entitlement. So it is to having the professional whose interests are the best interests and welfare of the child, ensuring that access is provided to the other resources, and particularly access to education. So we've heard in the evidence that children, young people, were not getting access to education. And in that, perhaps they were surprisingly similar to other vulnerable children who were not attending school in circumstances in the lockdown where they didn't have access to digital devices or to adults around them who were able to support their education and learning. So I think that was one of the main gaps, but there were certainly going to be other gaps that would emerge in terms of their social and emotional development and practical support that they might need to navigate the system and understand what is going on, and access to legal advice is all too scarce.
Thank you. And another point that you make in your statement is that there was evidence to show that large numbers of children who were accommodated in hotels went missing during the pandemic.
Yes, I mean, this is particularly concerning, yes.
And what is specific about that to the pandemic that concerns you, please?
Well, I think any child who goes missing is a problem for us in the fulfilment of our duties. But in this circumstance, we had much less ability or capacity and capability to actually identify where those children have gone. So there are still children we don't know where they are, what happened to them. Their risks of criminal and sexual exploitation are already understood to be significantly higher from their vulnerability and the nature of their accommodation. And so I don't think we've even begun really to understand what has happened to those children. And are we really looking now to plan to ensure, this is hundreds of children, this isn't one or two, this is hundreds of children who went missing. Have we understood how that could occur, and have we understood how it could be prevented? One of the things that leads children to go missing is because they have no one that they can talk to, depend upon, or trust. They have no familiarity with their support needs in terms of their emotional and cultural support. So they may run away in order to seek to find that with some form of extended community or diaspora. But the fear is that they are being lured away and having to remain under the sway or to become under the sway of those who are seeking to exploit them. So I would rather ask a question, and I hope the inquiry will help me to understand, how could that have occurred, and what are we doing to prevent it occurring again?
Understood. Thank you, Dr. Homden. I would like to ask you now about some of your conclusions overall.
Yes.
One of the things that you have identified during the course of your evidence today, and you do so also in your statement, is that in the future you say children must be explicitly accounted for in all levels of emergency planning.
Yes.
And that this must include mechanisms to address the impact of decisions on children.
Yes.
One of the mechanisms I think you have suggested during your evidence is for organisations such as Quorum specifically to be commissioned to undertake, for example, pieces of specialist guidance where necessary.
Yes.
What other particular mechanisms would you suggest would help in terms of first assessing impact of decisions?
Well, we should have a systematic approach to child impact assessments. We do not. We potentially could do that without the adoption of the United Nations Convention in English law, but certainly that would have the effect of dictating and amplifying that commitment. So we certainly should do so. Consultation with the Office of the Children's Commissioner is obviously an absolute requirement for future pandemics. But we have also made some other key recommendations, one of which is that there could be a dedicated cabinet minister for children. And I reflect upon the fact that had there been such a cabinet minister, the questions would get asked at a different level and more systematically across all aspects of multi-governmental decision-making. Where are the children in health? Where are the children in the Home Office? Where are the children? It's not only the DfE who actually did act as a champion for children, and I commend them for that. They made the case, they attempted forward planning within the parameters that have been set to them, they liberated more resources, they adapted guidance, and so we had that benefit, and as I say, we thank them for their work. But if we're to do better next time, then greater forward planning, greater use of structural bodies to anticipate that planning, and greater mobilisation, a much clearer pathway to the impact assessment of those scenarios, which would be enshrined by the incorporation of the UNCRC, and a cabinet minister to hold government to account for the children in our society whose democratic voice is otherwise not heard.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Holmden. Those are all my questions. My lady, do you have any questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Holmden. A grand note to finish on, obviously consistent with the great passion you've shown for a very worthy cause. Thank you very much indeed for your help to the inquiry, and thank you to your organisation for participating so fully with the inquiry. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you.
Mr. Lee.
My lady, the next witness is Mr. Charlie Taylor. My lady, may I please call Mr. Charlie Taylor?
Repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Mr. Taylor. I promise you we will finish you by lunchtime.
Very good.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. You have provided a witness statement to this inquiry dated the 25th of June 2025. And the reference we have for that is INQ 00064 9961. Can you confirm, please, that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can indeed.
Mr. Taylor, you are the current Chief Inspector of His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons. You've been in this role since the 1st of November 2020. And before that, and during the first wave of the pandemic, you were the chair of the Youth Justice Board. Is that correct?
I left the Youth Justice Board at the beginning of March 2020.
If we can start, please, with roles and responsibilities. His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons is an independent inspectorate for prisons in England and Wales and is required to report accurately, impartially and publicly concerning the treatment and conditions of detainees. This would include inspections of prisons that held children, these being young offender institutions and secured training centres. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can I just be clear? His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons is an inspectorate and not a regulator.
That's right.
And so, in short, you don't have the power to shut down a prison.
We don't, indeed.
Your role is simply to report on findings of what is happening.
Very simply, the exam question is, what's it like to be a prisoner in HMP X?
Mr. Taylor, can you explain, please, the vulnerabilities of children that are detained in prison?
Well, we know that children who end up in prison are overrepresented in certain ways, particularly involvement with the care system. So we think about a third, roughly, have experienced the care system in some shape or another. We know that there are high levels of learning difficulties. Many of them have had a very checkered educational past. Many have been brought up in homes where there is substance misuse, family breakdown, poverty, and often their time both in school and at home, their housing arrangements have been very disrupted throughout their childhoods.
Mr. Taylor, I want to now jump forward to January 2020 and ask you about the principal challenges that children's prisons faced on the eve of the pandemic, by reference to what was recorded in His Majesty's Chief Inspectorate of Prisons 2019 to 2020 annual report. And in that report, when discussing children's prisons, the report states that the outcome for many children have been appalling. Please, can you help us and tell us why?
During the, really for many years, the Inspectorate has been very concerned about the treatment of children in prison, particularly the lack of time that they spent out of their cells, the poor quality of education that was on offer for them, the levels of violence to which they and also staff members were often subjected, the limitations on things like visits, fresh air, and the opportunities for genuinely rehabilitative activity.
And can I just be clear, please, was that the position in January 2020?
Yes.
Mr. Taylor, given everything you have told the inquiry about the vulnerabilities of children and the challenges facing children's prisons, can you explain, please, what led to the decision to suspend inspections of young offender institutions on the 17th of March 2020?
Yes, we were actually mid-inspection when we initially made that decision. This was in the time of my predecessor, Peter Clark. They were inspecting Wetherby, and at the time, the number of COVID cases in the jail suddenly went through the roof, and therefore there was a decision taken to suspend that inspection. Then on the 17th of March, a decision was made to stop inspections as across the board prisons were beginning to lock down in anticipation of the final lockdown decision, which came, I think, the following week.
Can you help us why that decision was made to suspend inspections, please?
Because I think at the time there was such a concern about the risk of COVID, the lack of understanding about the dangers of the virus, and also the potential that we as inspectors could be coming into places of custody and spread and be spreaders of the virus ourselves. And also that we'd already seen in Italy, where one prison got hit very hard quite early on, and a large number of prisoners caught the virus, and sadly, some died.
Mr. Taylor, that deals with the suspension of inspections for young offender institutions. Can I just be clear in terms of secured training centre inspections? Am I right in saying that His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons carries out joint inspections of secure training centres with Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission?
Yes, with Ofsted being the lead on those.
And given Ofsted lead those inspections, was the decision therefore to suspend inspections of secure training centres in March 2020 a decision for Ofsted as opposed to a decision for His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons? Mr Taylor, on the 24th of March 2020, the day after the Prime Minister announced the first national lockdown, His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, HMPPS, issued COVID-19 operational guidance, which directed governors across the whole of the prison estate with immediate effect to stop all non-essential activities involving groups. Is it right that it was this guidance that led to a significant change in the prison regime?
Yes, it was.
Mr Taylor, I now want to go and ask you what life was like for children in prison during the pandemic. And from the 24th of March 2020, what impact did this operational guidance and change to prison regimes have on the time that children were spending in their cells?
Well, we went back to a shortened version of inspection just slightly less than a month later. So we visited the first 3 establishments holding children in April 2020. And what we were finding already then was that there were very high levels of lock-up for children. So they were behind their doors for up to 23 hours a day, that the amount of time they were getting outside was very limited. They weren't getting to education. They weren't getting able to socialise in any way. And any sort of rehabilitative exercises weren't happening. So they were basically locked in their cells.
And you mentioned that you carried out inspections of 3 different establishments. Was that consistent across the board?
Yes, we didn't describe them as inspections because we weren't going in with the same level of depth that we would normally have done with an inspection. And the idea was we would do a lighter touch initially whilst COVID was going on, so that we reduced the risk of us bringing the virus in, and we were in the prison for as short as possible. So we described them as visits, scrutiny visits, short scrutiny visits, rather than as inspections.
Mr Taylor, I want to ask you specifically about Secure Training Centre Rainsbrook. The inquiry understands that you conducted an assurance visit of Secure Training Centre Rainsbrook in October 2020 and found conditions that raised concerns. What were your most significant concerns following the assurance visit?
The real issue was the lack of imagination, I suppose, when it came to what were called reverse cohorting operations. So the idea was that when a new child came into the prison, that they would be isolated for a period of time to test whether they had the virus, and then they could be introduced more widely into the prison community. But what we found at Rainsbrook was that rather than being a little bit more creative about this, as they were in some of the YOIs, which was the young offender institutions, which was to, when 3 or 4 children arrived, to then put them into a bubble together and at least then unlock those children and allow them to socialise. What was going on at Rainsbrook was children were coming into the jail, they were being locked behind their door for initially 2 weeks, having very little human interaction, and in some cases barely getting out of their cell at all.
Mr Taylor, I think it's right, isn't it, that during the visits you found that some children were locked in their cells for 23.5 hours a day.
That's right.
And one girl had been forced to spend 48 consecutive hours in a cell.
Yeah.
You've set out to the inquiry why that is concerning to you. Who did you notify about those concerns following the October 2020 visit?
We and our colleagues at Ofsted produced a report which was then circulated to the ministers, to the prison service, as all our reports were, and with the expectation that actually Rainsbrook was getting this badly wrong and that we would return to the centre and expect there to be some fairly rapid change.
And you returned to Secure Training Centre Rainsbrook in December 2020. Had conditions improved?
Astonishingly, our expectations around the reverse cohorting and those arrangements had barely changed at all, and this was despite us having raised this with the prison service, having raised this with the centre itself, and also the prison service having its own monitors on site within the centre. So for whatever reason, that work simply wasn't done, and children were continuing to be locked up for far too long.
Did they give you an explanation as to why they'd ignored?
It was astonishing. It was almost as if no one was really checking. It was very early on when I just started at the inspectorate. And we just assumed that going in there, writing the initial report that we'd written and saying that, for goodness sake, there are ways of doing this in a more creative... We know it's difficult, but there are ways of doing this more creatively. And it was just really astonishing that monitors, leaders, the youth custody service, none of these people had picked it up.
And Mr Taylor, following the December assurance visit, the inquiry understands that His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons issued what you refer to as an urgent notification. Can you provide a very brief summary of what an urgent notification is, please?
Yes, this is a power that the Inspector of Prisons has, which is whereby I can write to the Secretary of State if we find conditions so serious within an establishment that we think something needs to be done urgently. So normally there's a lag between us inspecting the jail and producing a report. With an urgent notification, we will tell the Secretary of State within 3 days that we have these concerns, and there is an expectation that he or she will write back to us within 28 days with an action plan about what they're going to do.
Did Secure Training Centre Rainsbrook accept your findings?
To some extent, it's not an issue for us whether people accept our findings or not. Those were the findings. That was what we expected ministers and Rainsbrook to act on.
Mr Taylor, if we can now move on to the provision of education, please. Can you tell us what happened to education for children detained in prison following the 24th of March 2020?
Well, in the 4 public sector young offender institutions, Wetherby, Warrington, Feltham and Cookham Wood, education stopped and only began to ramp up again in the summer. The only place where education continued was at Park YOI, a G4S-run establishment in South Wales, where within a week of the lockdown starting, they were putting education. They had put education back on. They had kids out of their cells for 3 hours a day, and quite quickly that returned to the sorts of levels at that establishment that we'd seen pre-pandemic, so about 10 hours a day later on that year.
And you tell us in your report from your visit in April 2020 that the children in Park Young Offenders Institution were receiving at least 3 hours of purposeful time out of their cell, and that included 2.5 hours of face-to-face education. Can you help us with how they were able to offer that in light of what was happening at the public sector prisons? Yeah,
I think there's a number of things. The first was that Park was operating more effectively before COVID in the first place. The second advantage that Park had was that it was the education service within the YOI was also run by G4S, the provider. So there was no negotiation to be done between the provider and the jail itself. The third thing, I think, was the leadership within the jail. There was a very experienced leader of Park YOI, sits within a very big South Wales prison. And there was a very experienced leader, Janet Walsgrove, who was determined and had always been determined to keep services as positive as they could for children. And then finally, I think what we thought probably was the way in which they couched the question to Public Health Wales, which was rather than how do we stop COVID having an effect on the jail, it was how can we continue to run services while keeping our staff and prisoners safe from the effects of COVID. And I think as a result of management determination, the general culture of the place, the contracting arrangements, and the way in which they worked with Public Health Wales, very quickly they got to a much better situation than what we found in England.
And just on the topic of leaders in children's prisons, you say in your statement that following the cancellation of education in children's prisons in March 2020, governors at Cookham Wood and Wetherby had wanted to introduce some face-to-face education at the start of the pandemic. However, these efforts were undermined by HMPPS's decisions nationally to treat children in the same way as prisoners held in the adult estate. Mr. Taylor, what do you mean when you say that efforts were undermined? Was it the case that governors were ready to bring back face-to-face education?
Yes, and this was two things. First of all, as I understand it, the trade union for the education providers had decided to withdraw members from those prisons, but also it was the directive, as we saw often during the pandemic, was that directives were about prisoners generally, and the needs of children were an afterthought very often here. And you'll see some of the correspondence from my predecessor, Peter Clarke, about that. But the result was that education, a guillotine was put on education and attempts to reopen education quite quickly, and nothing really got going until we were going back in the summer, later on in the summer.
And Mr. Taylor, just on that point about staff being pulled from prisons, it might be suggested that the provision of education in children's prisons was lacking because providers and unions were opposed to providing classroom-based activities. You've mentioned that instance. Did you find any evidence of that throughout the young offenders institutions and secure training centres that you inspected or visited?
Yes, we did, yeah.
Mr. Taylor, in light of that, was there an alternative approach that could have been adopted to provide education?
Well, Park were managing to do it, and I think that showed what was possible. And there was an ambition in that establishment very quickly to get education back on. They understood the importance of education, but also the potential effect on stability and the effect of being locked up in children being locked in their cells for long periods of time. So there was a model that we could point to say, look, this is how you could make it work. But sadly, despite efforts in the community to get vulnerable children into education, that wasn't happening in YOIs.
Mr. Taylor, did you raise that with anybody or any decision maker about what approach could be adopted to help bring back education?
We consistently flagged up from our short scrutiny visits and then from our scrutiny visits, both in Peter Clarke's last annual report, which came out in around the time that September 2020, and then in my subsequent annual report, which came out in July the following year, we flagged up the fact that prisoners, and particularly children, were spending far too long locked behind their doors with nothing meaningful to do.
The inquiry understands that when education was stopped in March 2020, that education packs were provided to children in prison. Can you help us with that?
Look, these are kids who haven't been in school much. They're not massively motivated by the idea of someone shoving a folder under their door with some learning in that they might get marked a day or two later. So I think the effect of those education packs, some of them contain things like word searches, which help to pass the time. But in terms of actual learning, in terms of any meaningful progress with children's learning, I think it was pretty negligible.
Mr. Taylor, if we can now turn to social visits, what impact did the suspension of social and official visits from the 24th of March 2020 have on children detained in prison?
Well, there were some advantages in that telephone credit was extended to children and they were able to make more phone calls than they were previously. They also had in-cell telephony as well, which meant that they were able to make calls. But not being able to see family members face-to-face between March and June that year was incredibly concerning from our point of view, particularly where you've got young children who are vulnerable, whose relationships with their parents are absolutely essential to their progression within the jail, that those weren't going ahead was a real concern for us. We understood early on, because those were the rules that we were all subjected to, but over the course of time, it seemed that, as ever with the prison service and COVID, that the restrictions in the prison service took far longer to be lifted than they did in the community.
And again, Mr. Taylor, did you raise that point about restrictions not matching what was being applied in the community to decision makers or via inspection reports? Again,
we highlighted the effect of, for example, prisoners there was no social contact. You could only have people from certain. You couldn't have mixed visits from people from different. Sorry, I can't remember the language. Different COVID bubbles coming in and meeting. So, for example, if you had a family that was split up. So this was something that we were concerned about, and we continue to raise, both at the time, but also in my subsequent annual report as well.
If we can now turn to the provision for new arrivals. You've dealt with this at Secure Training Centre Rainsbrook, but Mr. Taylor, I want to ask that in your witness statement, you say that arriving in prison for the first time, and this is in relation to children, during the pandemic, those children received far less support to deal with this new experience. And you go on to say that the regimes for new arrivals were worse than for any other children. Can you explain why, please?
Yes, so what YOIs and STCs, were secure training centres, were trying to do was to stop newcomers coming into the jail and spreading the virus around the prison, which was not an unreasonable thing to do. But what it meant was that rather than mixing with the general population, these children were kept isolated. Now, what we saw in Rainsbrook was an absurd gold plating of those arrangements where children were locked up, not only from staff, from their peers, even if their peers had only recently arrived in the jail. What more sensible, and I think we commented this in the SV at, the SSV at the short scrutiny visit of Feltham in July, was that actually they were being a bit more creative about if 3 or 4 children come in over the course of the week, we'll at least put them into a bubble together, and at least therefore then there is an opportunity for those children to be able to socialise a bit and to be able to do activities together. But nevertheless, that was dependent on whether you got on with those people, whether they might have been different ages, they might have had different abilities and interests and all sorts of things. But it was at least an attempt to try and sensibly interpret the regulations.
Mr. Taylor, just on the topic of regimes, you've set out the regime restrictions across the children's prisons. Can I ask a general point as to whether the regimes were applied consistently as a whole?
The more the prisons are locked down, the more consistent the regime is. I.e., what we found was where prisoners were locked up for 23 hours a day, they would tend to get the entitlement, whatever it was they were supposed to get, a shower and a chance to go outside in the hour that was left. But by the time we returned in 2021, regimes had expanded, but we still found that with things like the effect of COVID spreading amongst things like staff, that there was inevitably a bit of fickleness when it came to the delivery of regimes.
And Mr. Taylor, as you know, the inquiry wants to focus on prison conditions during the pandemic. So from March 2020 to June 2022, we know that the community started to open up. Was that reflected in prison regimes?
Nothing like at the rate that we would have expected to have seen. I mean, before COVID happened, we were regularly seeing children unlocked for kind of 7 or 8 hours a day, not nearly enough, but 7 or 8 hours a day in public sector YOIs, about 10 to 12 hours a day in park. A year later, at the end, even during the pandemic, and then towards the end of the pandemic, we were still seeing children locked up behind their doors for 20 hours a day, so getting out for not much more than 4, and if they're lucky, 5. And sadly now, we don't see children in public sector YOIs getting out for 7 hours a day, except on average in any establishment apart from park.
Mr Taylor, if we can now turn to decision making. You've alluded to this throughout your evidence this morning, and you explain in your statement that at the start of the pandemic, His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service gave too little attention to the distinct needs of children in custody. Why do you take that view?
Well, because the needs of children are different, and yet there was a blanket application of the rules. The ordinance came down that prisons would lock down, and they would lock down in a certain way, and that children were simply swept up in that rather than thinking more particularly about the needs of children.
You also raised concerns in your statement that children in young offender institutions are being subjected to the same regime as adults, and that follows on, Mr Taylor, to the point that you have just made.
Indeed.
And as the inquiry knows, the restrictions that were implemented on the 24th of March 2020 were applied across the board.
Yeah.
So that included adult prisons and children's prisons. What were your principal concerns about HMPPS taking this approach and not making that distinction?
Well, look, we understood, the inspectorate understood that very early on that there was a huge concern about the effect of the pandemic, and we were all worried about the level of risk. So initially, very early on, the first couple of weeks of lockdown, one could understand what was going on. But then as prisons themselves wanted to try and open things up more, where they wanted to get the education offer improved, where the ordinance from the centre was that actually you can't do this, that was when we began to get frustrated. So if you look at the short scrutiny visits we did, the first was on the 21st of April, and we were critical, but not very critical, of the regimes. By the time we went back and did our second lot of short scrutiny visits, we were very critical of the paucity of the regimes that we were finding within children's establishments.
And what responses were you getting from decision makers, the people that were running prisons, the government, when you were raising these concerns later on into the pandemic?
Lots of talk about ambition, and this is something we'd like to do, but very little in terms of action, in terms of actual change.
You also reported on inspection concerns raised in respect of autonomy of establishments at local level. Can you expand, please, on these concerns and explain why you deemed having autonomy to make decisions at governor level was important during the pandemic?
Well, I think because the way prisons are set up varies so much. So, for example, a jail like Feltham has very separate units, separate units of about 60 beds, and the potential for how you will be able to run that versus something like Warrington or Wetherby, which feel like much more like a very traditional type of prison design, meant that actually the governors in those two different jails could have been able to make arrangements, but they would have been quite different arrangements because of the nature of the building, because of the amount of staff they had, because of the nature of the staff, because of the facilities that they had on offer. So that was our sense, that actually giving governors parameters under which to operate, but giving them the flexibility to be able to do things in a way that was in the best interest of their children and staff felt sensible to us. But sadly, there was a yank on the reins from the centre, a yank, I would say, that has never been entirely released, even now.
Mr Taylor, I started off asking you about the conditions and your principal concerns about the challenges facing children's prisons in January 2020. What overall impact did the pandemic have on those pre-existing challenges?
Well, interestingly and unsurprisingly, perhaps, levels of violence reduced within young offender institutions. If children are locked behind their door for 23 hours a day and they're only unlocked with a couple of other, 2 or 3 other children, then the opportunities for conflict were reduced. So what we saw initially was levels of violence actually went down, that staff, because only a few children were unlocked at any one time, actually what some of the children told us was that relationships with staff had actually got better to some extent, because rather than a wing of 60 being unlocked, there were just a handful of children being unlocked at any one time. But what we've seen subsequently as the pandemic went on was that actually these arrangements were fomenters of further violence as prisons begun to open up. Because what were bored children doing who were locked up in their cells for 23 hours a day? Well, they started winding each other up through their cell doors. That these bubbles began to identify in sort of gang-like behaviour. And what we then saw was that when they then tried to unlock larger numbers of children, there was already a lot of latent conflict that we then saw play out in levels of violence that continue to be the highest of any part of the prison system.
And Mr. Taylor, finally, having reflected on what happened during the pandemic, what can be done to better protect the rights of children and the conditions in prisons in the event of a future pandemic?
Well, I think the first thing is maintaining independent inspection. And I think it's a great credit to my predecessor, Peter Clark, to the Inspectorate of Prisons and also to the prison service that actually we maintained, with only a short break, we maintained our presence within prisons, and a great credit to governors who worked with us during that time as well. But I do think that is critical to maintain at least some level of independent scrutiny, particularly of places that are inevitably covered up behind a wall. But I think also considering children differently, thinking of children as different from adult prisoners. And I think there was a failure to do that. And I think thirdly was about trying as much as possible to replicate the freedoms that were granted over time, or the reduction in restrictions over time, so that within the community to reflect that within prisons. And what we saw was the lag was far too slow in being able to do that, particularly with when it came to the provision of education, which was clearly stipulated that vulnerable children should be receiving an education in the community and they shouldn't be locked out of schools. And yet in prisons, these children were locked out of schools for very long periods of time.
Can I go back to your first point, Mr. Taylor? You said maintaining oversight, and I totally understand the importance of that. But what is the point of all your staff going in, putting themselves at risk, putting other people at risk, coming up with instances of good practice and bad practice, and then no one doing anything?
Because I think the fact that we were highlighting it in the first place, I think is important. And I think the fact that we were able to... I mean, ultimately, for example, Rainsbrook, we issued an urgent notification. OK, nothing got done initially, but finally, conditions at Rainsbrook did begin to improve when it came to the reverse cohorting arrangements. They fell off a cliff in other ways later on, and the place was closed. But, you know, it is a frustration of everybody who's held this job that we can't make people do things, but we can at least shine light and provide oxygen into places of custody that the public don't always see and don't always know about. So if nothing else, I think we stop things from getting worse. But on a good day, I think we help things to get better.
Mr. Taylor, those are all my questions. My lady, do you have any further questions?
Not at the moment, but Mr. Broach does. Behind you, I'm afraid, Mr. Taylor.
That's all right.
If you can make sure your voice keeps going into the microphone.
I will.
Thank you.
My lady, I'm grateful. Good afternoon, Mr. Taylor. I represent the children's rights organisations, and I'd like to ask you about continued restrictions imposed on children in custody once lockdown restrictions were lifted generally, and the enduring impact of this on children and the youth estate. You say at paragraph 205 of your statement that even today, that being late June 2025, many YOIs are still operating restricted regimes and access to education remains reduced. And you give examples in the previous paragraph of restrictions, including excessive amounts of time in cell far too many children having less than 2 hours out of their cell a day, and very poor access to and provision of education and other purposeful activity. Could I ask what explanation was provided to you as to why children in custody continued to face significant restrictions long after restrictions on the general public had been lifted?
Well, I think one of the issues was the effect, actually, of the COVID bubbles that were created. So actually, what you find with children coming into prison is sometimes they have affiliations to do with postcodes or to do with gangs, and that can be a cause of conflict. And what we see is sometimes, quite sensibly, certain children are kept separate from each other if they're serving relatively short sentences. But what we found as a result of COVID was not only you had these normal postcode, what we call keeper parts, but what we were finding as a result of this was actually keeper parts were being created by the prison system itself. So it was actually compounding the kind of gang-type behaviour. It wasn't gang behaviour, but gang-type behaviour and affiliations that children were having to people within their bubble. And YOI's really struggled with breaking down the barriers between some of these groups of children, partly because staff weren't experienced, partly because behaviour management continues to be an issue that's poor, partly because incentives aren't good enough, partly because the quality of education isn't good enough as another incentive. So what we've continued to see is these spider webs of keeper part lists, where X can't be with Y, who can't be with A, who can't be with B, who can't be with X, who can't be with Y. Meaning that at times what we're seeing on some wings is the prison operating 3 and I think even 4 different regimes at any one time. Now, if you can only unlock, if you're having to divide your day between 4, what it means is the amount of time that is possible for children to be unlocked is much reduced. So it's partly a result of these COVID bubbles, and it's partly a result of poor behaviour management, a lack of real leadership drive within the youth custody service and the prison service to break down and to deal with some of these conflict issues and to actually motivate children to behave and to be successful in education. Now, these are difficult challenges, and I absolutely recognise that children are coming into prison and some of them are very challenging. But nevertheless, what we're seeing now is that the standard of education, the amount of time out of cell that children are getting is considerably worse, apart from in Part YOI, is considerably worse than what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And standards of education just have not improved.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
On that point, Mr. Taylor, you mentioned a lot about standards of education. I think you're a little bit familiar with the world of education.
Indeed, I was a former head teacher of a special school.
It's just important to me that you do know what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Obviously you do, but education being one of your particular skills. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Taylor. I'm really grateful to you for your help, both obviously in providing the report, and I will be going through, if there's something in the written report, your written statement, don't worry, I will be bearing everything in mind, but thank you for coming on today and all your help.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you, my lady.
I think we've got a problem with the witness not being here until 12:30, so we have to have an early lunch. So I shall return at 1:30. Thank you, Mr.